Hello, welcome to Breaking Down Character Design. So I started this character design by picking out a few references that had some interesting elements that I wanted to work with. I liked the details on these lion dog, mermaid dog. I don't really know what they are, but they look kind of cool. I imagined them to be some kind of lion, maybe a dragon. This was some sort of pouch that people used to wear, and with an intricate design on it of some flowers and moths. And this was a ukiyo-e painting of some courtesan, probably. So I started my design by coming up with a pose. The pose was mostly just out of my head, some pre-existing knowledge. I broke down these three images into the main themes and attributes that they have. And I started applying it to the character, which led me to sketch number 2. So, with the ukiyo-e painting, I took the outfit style and the hair ornaments, and I've applied them onto the character. The second image, I took the lion dog motif and I applied it as a pattern onto the sleeves of the outfit. And I gave her ears. Same ears as on the antique. Down here, I took the moth and used it as a theme, although it's actually not on the sketch, it's on a different sketch. Same with the accessory. I ended up changing this sketch into sketch 3. And for sketch 3, I decided to change the kimono style because I felt like this one, it was very influenced by this image, and I wanted to change it up a bit, make it a little more fantasy. So I shortened it and added a long draping piece of fabric instead. And here you can see I put the moth theme, and I used the string for the decoration on the shoe or on her leg. I originally had some moths on the bottom of the dress as well. So these elements, they're all processed. They're processed from the references. Whereas the elements on this side, these are more to do with my visual library. I thought that the hime cut would suit this character, and I felt the short kimono style would be more interesting than the long one. That requires me knowing about these to begin with, having some prior exposure to them. And so I combined the processed parts and the pre-existing parts to create this character design. Following that, I worked on the colors. So the colors were inspired by mostly these two. I broke them down into their color palette and applied it to the character. And to apply it to the character, I mostly just used the lasso fill tool. I actually didn't color it too neatly, if you have a closer look. In the end, I decided that the hairstyle, the color of the hair, was a little overwhelming, and I didn't want it to clash with the outfit. Not clash, but kind of clash attention-wise. So you wouldn't know whether to look up here or down here, because they're both black and strong. This led me to try out some different colors. I think the original color palette, the green color, I was thinking jade, but I didn't like it too much in the end. I ended up going more for the blue color on the lion dogs. And I brightened up the yellow as well. With this yellow gold, I brightened it so it looks more like the yellow in this image, rather than the duller yellow of the string. Oh, here we go. So, as I said before, I felt that the hair was a bit too dark, and so I ended up changing it to a lighter color. I think that this makes the hair ornaments... Actually, no, I'd say the hair ornaments stood out no matter what color the hair was, but I feel that the design is more balanced now with the lighter hair color, because it feels more orderly. Here, the black of the hair kind of merges with the black of the costume, and I think it felt a little more confusing to look at, so I ended up changing it. After this, I turned the opacity of the original sketch down, and then I started drawing in bits of line art. So I didn't actually line all of it, I believe. Let me double check. Yeah, I didn't end up lining the sleeves and the shapes down here because I felt like the shapes were defined enough, because the background is white, that I didn't need to put a line. But for the legs and the face and the hair, I went in and changed up a few of the details as well as I went along, especially the hair. I felt that the hair was kind of messy, and just the shapes were a bit unclear, like there's a little blob sticking out from the sleeve, and I just ended up getting rid of it completely. I reduced the size of the head a little bit as well, so that the hairstyle was less puffy and followed the shape of the skull a bit better. I started detailing in the sleeves. I used the moth, the pattern on the moth, as an inspiration for the bottom of the sleeves, and the pattern of this white moth in particular for the one on her belt. I used the pattern of the string in the pattern of the string on her obi as well. And from there, to be honest, at this point, you could also just clean up the drawing and have flat colors, and then you can use it as a reference. But I wanted to finish up the drawing into something more presentable. With my style, I like to have some shading. I like to apply some, I guess, cell shading would be kind of the word for it, onto the character to give it form. I like to use round shapes with small bits of almost like line shapes to help create more edges. So instead of drawing a line art, I just have the absence of shadow create that line art instead. It essentially does the same job as a line art while not being a line. And I fill in the shadow using a linear burn layer. And I just have the linear burn layer clipped onto all my base colors. And the base colors includes a few layers like these, which are details that I added on top. And since I didn't want to line them again, but I needed them to have lines to let them stand out, I used the border effect. So this border effect can really help them stand out more as a shape without having to bother to line it manually. You can just focus on the shape of the object instead, which is quite useful for adding in details after you've already kind of got the base completed. I have the hair linear burn layer on a separate layer, but I painted them all on the same layer first, and then what I would do, because I want the color of the linear burn on lighter parts to be a different color than the body, not the body, the clothing, because the clothing is so dark, I selected the layer with the hair, this layer here, by holding Control and clicking on this little box. It's going to select everything that's on that layer. Then I grabbed okay, let's say these are merged. I'm just going to merge them now. It's all on one layer now, right? But since I have the hair area selected, I'm just going to copy it, delete it, paste it on a new layer. Then I just need to make these linear burn again. And now you have the shading for the hair on a separate layer. And just clip it to the base colors once more. I did the same for the skin. Because the thing is, if the shading is all the same color, I'm just going to show you what it looks like. The shading for the skin is the same color as the clothing, and same for the hair. It's too dark. It's too dark and it doesn't have enough saturation to them, which is why I separated them so that I can add more saturation to the colors. And I believe that they are also a lighter value. Yeah, so the shadow for the face is a lighter value than the shadows for the darker parts as a result. But values-wise, the thing that I wanted to maintain the most was the darkness of the outfit versus the rest of the body. I think that it makes a nice contrast that the, what do you call it, this back part that's coming down, the back of the dress helps the legs stand out due to the contrast between the light values of the skin and the dark values of the back of the dress. And then I like the contrast between the darkness of the kimono and the skin and hair. I wanted to keep that. If I made them the same color, this is what it would look like instead. I think that the values for the shadow of the skin and hair are just too strong. So by separating them, I can keep it clean and easy to look at. At this point, I've got pretty much all the main elements down that I wanted. There's not much difference between these two folders except I flattened out the coloring on the hair. Since I was planning to not have much shading at first, I actually started coloring in the hair a bit more, but since I have this shading, I don't need that as much, so I softened it out. Finally, at this stage, I rendered the artwork a bit more. This is not super necessary for character design, but I wanted the character design to be more presentable. And so you can see I took some time to clean up around the sleeves, the moth, the fabric that's coming down, and the face. I feel like cleaning up the face of a character makes so much difference in the appeal and the finish of an artwork. Went in and added more detail to the eyelashes, the pupils, the cheek. I changed up the shading a little more while I was at it. Made it a little more detailed. And you can see that I've broken down further what I've taken from the references. So the lions were the main color palette inspiration, and the picture down here was how I broke down the moths. So moths usually have like this antenna thing, and I integrated it into the hair ornament. So you can see that the hair ornament, the idea of having hair ornaments came from this image. Let me use the pink. Came from this image, but the shape of them came from the moth. I tilted them down to kind of resemble the legs of a moth. That makes sense. And then these are the little hairy antennae that moths have. I also ended up using this flower pattern on the shoes. Little subtle bit of detail. Because the leg area is quite free of detail, I decided to add more detail onto the shoes. I put these moths back here. Okay, the reason I removed the moths was because I didn't want so much going on all over the character. Because if you have just so much detail everywhere and they're kind of not placed in a way that tells the viewer where to look, if I just put them like this, the viewer will just have too many things to look at. Now this part is so busy and the arms are so busy, the middle of the body is so busy, and the head is busy, and the feet are busy. It's busy everywhere, so you don't really have any resting spots. To be honest, this isn't super bad. Just imagine I put them everywhere. Put so many of them down, put them all over this tail. It's just a lot. And because they're white, or not white, cream, they kind of conflict with the legs. So the legs don't really stand out as much anymore, and the legs get dragged into this whole busy situation. So that's why it's better to have concentrated bits of detail instead. Here, here, and down here. They're all spread out. Little points of interest. I'd say that the main attraction is probably the moth. Then second, the head. And then next, I decided to put the detail on the shoes so that there's a reason for the viewer to follow the legs down and see the pattern here. But yeah, by putting some detail here, it actually makes the legs stand out a little more just due to the balance of the points of detail. Overall, I also made the character look quite friendly despite the kind of menacing design of the lion dogs on her clothing. I would say that's because I've focused on this round, curly shape everywhere, which generally people associate with friendliness. If you think of something cute, something not very harmful, something unassuming, you'd probably associate it with round shapes, like a kitten or a puppy. They're very round. And the moth as well. Even the wings are quite rounded out. The tassels are round. The shape of the kimono, the bottom of the sleeves, they're all very rounded out, and to add on top, the face is looking very friendly. Friendly expression, doe eyes as opposed to cat eyes or siren eyes. The friendliest of eye designs. And her expression, she's smiling. Along with downturned ears, downturned, round looking ears, they're actually also kind of resembling the ears of a deer as opposed to a lion, which are more sticking out. Actually, I think lion ears are probably not very menacing as well, since they're kind of round. But the ears in this image, they're a bit sharper and they're sticking out. So I decided to bring them down. And then I create this friendly looking lion dog moth design. With this design, even though I'm having her stand quite plainly, something that adds to the appeal is all the subtle ways that I've actually had her pose. Even though it's a plain pose, she's not standing just like this. You know what I mean? Because I feel like when we think of a plain pose, we might just think, oh yeah, just standing, arms down, looking towards the camera. But actually, although it's a pose that will show off her design well, I've added this arm reaching out so that you can see the sleeve design in different positions and also in different heights, so that the height of one sleeve is not the same as the height of the other, and it just adds a little bit of that imbalance to make the composition interesting to look at. One knee is in the sunlight, so it's bent forward a little bit, causing the fabric to fold down, as opposed to just, you know, like a rectangle. Having a rectangle would look quite stiff. We want the fabric to flow, to look like it's really draping off the character's body, as opposed to sticking onto it like a wooden board. One foot is actually in front of the other as well, so they're not just parallel, and the face is actually tilted slightly to the side, with the lighting really emphasizing the shape of the face to give it a bit of visual interest. When I colored the character, I also thought about composition as well. How to spread out the colors, spread out the main colors so that the character is interesting to look at, and how to layer them. So here I've got black on gold, on white, on blue, on white again, because I'm thinking about how to make the different elements stand out against each other. The moth is white, and so if I had this band be white as well, and if I didn't have this blue rope to separate the moth, it would be a lot harder for the moth to stand out on this obi. But thanks to the layering in the design, the moth can stand out a lot more. In the design, the moth can stand out a lot more, along with the way that I've placed the shadow. So I purposely put part of this obi in shadow, and the moth is actually not in shadow at all. And so this makes the ornament stand out against the cloth behind it. Same with the shadow on this side. It is surrounded by shadow. so that the wings look like they're coming out towards the viewer a little bit. Mostly flat, but adds a little bit of dimension because of that shadow that's around it. If you're actually working with a client on character design specifically, then it would actually be better if you had more iterations. So character design, concept design, is different to illustration in the way that your job is actually more to do with exploring ideas and creating iteration as opposed to creating an aesthetic and appealing artwork. So if we go back to my sketch, you would likely be expected to come up with a lot more of these options and different ways for the same elements to fit together, because the character didn't have to look like this. I could have broken down the references differently. I could have instead taken, let's say, this as the main outfit inspiration, the outfit shape. And then maybe I'd have the character wear a huge helmet, some sort of big helmet. Well, maybe it's too big. It's getting a little too big for my tiny character. But imagine, I don't know, she's a feral child with a massive cape helmet thing. And let's say she wears another big cape. And it has these flowers on it. Flowers from below. Then in front, you can see the strings. So even though I'm using the same references, I can come up with an entirely different design just by changing how the pieces fit together. And if you're working with a client who is looking for a character design, then it'll be your job to come up with these ideas for them, as opposed to just coming up with one character and completing it to finish like this. I think that is not a huge reason for you to complete the character design unless it's for your own satisfaction or for portfolio purposes, because in the end, the rendering does affect the appeal of the design. At this point, the design is almost the same as this next rendered design, right? It's essentially there. However, you can tell that the rendering makes the character look a lot better. But if it's just for your own reference purposes, you could also just stop here and then use this as a reference, right? It's good enough. Although the face probably does change the overall appearance of the character a decent amount. So how do you actually render a character to this point if it's so important? Well, let me first explain why I have to render my design from this point. Is because I have such shoddy line art. So people who have really good line art and really enjoy doing line art, you can just have your finished product at this point because your line art is so good that you can just use it as is. But I really enjoy painting, so I tend to set myself up to have a painting process, which is my setup. My setup is less finished looking, definitely a work in progress, and my lines are kind of all over the place, not very clean. And then on top of that, I just enjoy spending time to go through and add all these details. And how I do that is I'll grab a brush, whether it's the oil brush or I like this transparent tool. If I press lighter, it'll go lighter. Not lighter, it'll be less opacity. So you can see it's kind of transparent. This is good for blending because the harder you press, the more opaque it is. I like to use this pen for when I'm blending, but I don't want it to be completely smooth. I want it to be more controlled. Then I'll use this one. If I want smooth blending, I'll use something softer. It's like in between that brush and like an airbrush. And I also use the G pen. The G pen for sharper lines. Basically, I just go around the whole artwork. This character I wouldn't say is completely finished rendering, but I'd say I managed to cover most of the areas that looked really concerning to me. So I cleaned up the areas that attracted attention and were looking kind of shoddy. So basically I go through and I make the shapes and lines and everything more appealing, or I'm clarifying what's happening in an area. So I found that the shape of the wings of the moth looked really weak, and I think this does affect the character design. So I cleaned it up to be sharper and more moth-like, a little more symmetrical. I fixed up the mouth and the face a lot. I think I started by just using this base and adding details to them, adding eyelashes, adding a little bit of warm toned, saturated orange red to create the edges of the eyes. And then I ended up liquefying them a little bit to fix their position and size. So let me just reaffirm that getting to this stage of rendering is not important for the purpose of this class. I'd say that getting to this stage, or even without the shading, getting to this stage is enough. Just a clean version of your character where you can tell what the details are. Maybe at this point you can render it a little bit just so the patterns are clear. You can understand what's going on. But the reason that I wanted to go over a little bit of beyond that, like adding in the shadow and rendering and whatnot, is just because it's good for your portfolio. It makes the design more presentable. And if you're working with a client and you want them to be happy, then giving them a presentable design will make them happy in the end. Will likely help them like your design. Because if I look at these two designs, which one would I be more likely to enjoy, despite them kind of representing the same character? I probably think she looks a lot nicer, even though their design is the same. Essentially the same. Alternatively, you could also just stop at this point, or whichever point you feel comfortably depicts the character design you're wanting, and just redraw it completely. Redraw it in a new pose or as an illustration, however you want. It'll just come out a lot easier now that you have come up with the design. Because a lot of my lines here will be quite messy as a result of me erasing and redrawing parts because I was still in the conception phase. So a lot of the lines that I put down weren't permanent, and I don't end up erasing things perfectly, which is why I got rid of the line art and started redrawing the lines just so I could have line art that was cleaner. I want to finish off with, picture can say 1,000 words, and this is very true for character designs. In every aspect of your character, you are conveying something about the character to the viewer. The pose, the color scheme, the expressions, the textures, the style, the list goes on forever. Design is about understanding the viewer's perception. While you don't have to utilize each and every attribute to their maximum potential, by knowing the options you have available to you, you increase your capacity to weave in these elements when the need calls for it. This allows you to better communicate your design concept. Okay, that is all for the theory part of character design. I hope that you were able to learn something from this lesson, and now let's move on to the exercise. The exercise for character design is concept ideation. The skills we will be practicing are designing with intention and composing visually appealing designs. The task is to design a character from one image reference. I suggest using something like an antique that has enough visual elements for you to break down and use. What I mean by that is, for example, if your reference is just a square, a filled in square color, you don't have too much to work with here because the reference is just so simple. You really only have a square and the color pink. So it would be better to grab something that's a little more complicated, that just has a few more elements to it that you can use for basing your design off of. And I would like you to come up with 2 to 3 alternate designs based off the initial concept. And you don't need to completely change the design unless you want to. You don't need to have 3 completely different designs. You can have one that you come up with, and then you explore the character in some different theming or different personality or different environment, and then you have 3 alternate designs. For level 2, I want you to develop one of the concepts from the previous exercise. So remember all those mood boards and the sketches that you came up with? I want you to pick your favorite one and try to design appearances that align with the original chosen prompt that you have, the 2 to 3 words that you pick. And also, I'd like you to come up with 2 to 3 alternate designs based off that initial concept. So the difference between level 1 and level 2 is that for level 1, I want you to focus on just arranging the elements in an appealing way on the character, putting the colors and the shapes and the form, putting these first. But for number 2, I want you to think a little bit more about the prompts that we had and come up with almost like a story or a setting for the character, and think about how the setting and the personality of the character would affect their appearance while you are designing the concept. So these are training kind of 2 different important skills that are part of character design. Level 3, I want you to pick your ultimate favorite design and bring it to a presentable state by cleaning it up, rendering it out, making it look like a finished artwork. Okay, that is the exercise and the end of the lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I will see you in the